So, hi everyone, my name is Nick. Well, I kind of know all of you anyway to begin with, so nice to see you again. So for the first chunk of today's meetings, Greg spoke to us about the very recent history of Scientonomy. After that, Jakob spoke to us sort of about the present of Scientonomy, at least what kind of workflow we go through today to adjust our scientonomic theories. And now I am going to talk to you about the world of the future. Or I was supposed to say the world of tomorrow, the future. My talk is going to come to you like the Lord of the Rings in 3 parts. Part number 1, I'm going to talk about open questions. Essentially, what I want to talk about is what do we think are the most important upcoming questions that currently have no answers in Scientonomy, and we'll go over some of the biggest questions and show you how to find them on our encyclopedia as well. Part 2, I'm going to talk about how we store, or how we could store, our observational scientonomic data. And mini spoiler alert, it's not necessarily on the encyclopedia. This would require a new type of database. I'll talk a little bit more about that afterwards. And then part 3, which is kind of why we're all here today. Part 3 is about building on our outreach campaign and trying to figure out what we're going to do moving forward to kind of spread the word of this science of science that we're trying to develop. So let's start with open questions. We know through our scientonomic workflow that one of the most important fruits of this workflow is the creation of open questions in our seminars. These open questions, we know that they're stated on the Encyclopedia of Scientonomy. So if we jump to the encyclopedia, we can click on the Community Scientonomy page. Down here, we go down, click on Descriptive Theories. It'll show you this list of, we have topics on the one side and accepted answers on the other side. And I think Jakob showed you this. What we can do to sort of reorganize and identify the open questions, if you click accepted answer, it'll just reorganize everything for you. So we have a whole bunch of really, really interesting and really important open questions. These are questions which don't have an accepted answer in Scientonomy. I'm going to go over 4 of them. These aren't necessarily the most important. All of these are important. It's just to give you an idea of some of the biggest questions that we're hoping some of you who are perhaps in our seminar will consider maybe writing a paper about to propose a modification. So first things first, we're going to talk about the delegation of authority to artifacts. This delegation of authority idea is genius. Whoever came up with it, amazing. So let's take, for example, we have a community of astronomers. Certainly within this community of astronomers, they have sub-communities, specific research teams and research centers. Let's say you had a sub-community like NASA, the research team at NASA. It's customary for astronomers to delegate a certain type of authority to NASA over certain specific astronomical questions. There's sort of a next step that we can take, which is that NASA themselves will delegate authority to, let's say, the Hubble telescope, or they might delegate their authority to another instrument like to the Curiosity rover on Mars right now, right? So sometimes we have this kind of delegation of authority to an instrument. The same thing happens in, let's say, a particle physics. We know that the researchers at CERN are delegating a certain amount of authority to something like the Large Hadron Collider. And so this happens time and time again where instruments are involved in helping us better understand the world. Now here's our question. Is this really a case of authority delegation? In other words, is there such a thing as delegating authority to an artifact like a telescope or a particle accelerator or to an artificial intelligence? If it is the case, well, how can there be an authority delegation to a non-communal entity? Because these instruments aren't necessarily the same as a community of any sort. So how can we delegate authority to something that, in addition to not actually being a community, probably doesn't really have a mosaic of its own? This is a huge open question, especially when we consider how big the field of the history of technology is.
I have a question on the delegation of authority to artifacts or instruments, which I assume are the same thing?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just wondering how theory-ladenness of instruments factors into that question, because if, say, the example you used was the telescope, right?
Yeah.
So NASA is delegating their authority to a telescope. A star is a certain distance because the telescope says it is, for example.
Yeah.
But the telescope will be constructed based on certain theories that we've come
Yeah.
up with prior. So NASA is delegating authority to the telescope, which is based on theories.
Yeah.
So would they not be then sort of relying on the theories themselves, and in which case I just consider that very normal and for that scientist to do?
That's beautiful. And pretty much what you're doing is you're starting to answer the question and provide a very reasonable answer. And as you're talking about sort of the theory-ladenness of instruments, everyone's slowly being like nodding their heads all around you. They're like, oh yeah, I know theory-laden, that makes sense. This is fantastic. And this means maybe this is something that you can propose as an answer. That sounds like something reasonable to me. I guess my point in highlighting these open questions is to say that we don't currently have an accepted answer to a question like that. And so while intuitively this sounds like it makes sense, in order to move our scientonomic knowledge forward, we should explicitly formulate it somehow, right? A second open question concerns disciplinary boundaries. Obviously, we know that a community's mosaic consists of all of its accepted theories and all of its employed methods at a given time. But we also know that it's sort of customary for these communities to kind of divide up into different disciplines or subfields or fields. Here we kind of visually represent these disciplines through the separate mosaic tiles. It's just a visual metaphor. But we know that we have these different subfields: physics, chemistry, you can go on and on. Now, our question here, the open question, is how do these disciplinary boundaries actually exist within the mosaic? Rephrased, the question we can ask is, are the boundaries between these disciplines expressible through theories and methods, that is, through our sort of fundamental scientonomic entities? We currently don't know, and yet we think that disciplines are very important to understanding how science changes over time, to understanding how scientists organize their questions, and so on. So we have open questions about the status of disciplinary boundaries. Another question concerns the status of technological knowledge. This is very different from this question of delegation of authority to instruments. When we talk about accepted theories, we focus on empirical sciences and we focus on formal sciences. Now, our question is, what is the status of technological knowledge, the sort of know-how in a given mosaic? So let me give you a few quick examples. Say we have a proposition like X is an effective treatment for medical condition Y, or Z is a useful technology for bridge building, or P is a statistically valid technique for assessing public opinion on Q. It's clear that these propositions are definitely used in practical applications. What is unknown is whether or not we can say that these propositions are also accepted in a community. The actual role that they play is currently unknown, hence open question. The final question I have arose from putting together of the encyclopedia. While we were putting the encyclopedia together, we kind of realized that we have a set of accepted theories, and we know that each of these theories that we're proposing, they're all responses to specific questions. And these questions have been essential in guiding the data that we've been putting into the Encyclopedia of Scientonomy. We know that these questions or topics are essentially one of the key categories that we're using in our encyclopedia. So the question that sort of came out of this is the question on the status of questions. Are these questions part of the process of scientific change, or are they merely useful instruments for storing scientonomic data? To kind of build on that, what is the ontological status of questions or topics? We know that some questions appear to be more relevant in certain time periods and within certain communities. So, for example, in the 16th century, it was reasonable to ask, what is the distance from the Earth to the sphere of the stars? However, nowadays, it wouldn't necessarily be such a relevant question. So it seems to suggest that they're not merely useful instruments for storing data, but that they're also important in somehow shaping how science changes over time, If that's so, are these questions separate ontological entities, or are they simply reducible to theories and methods? And again, just to kind of repeat this is a question that we only thought of because we were entering this data onto the encyclopedia and we attached every theory to a specific question and we said, this is kind of shaping how we're developing our scientonomic theory. Maybe it has some kind of influence over scientific change more generally as well. So here's just a huge list, and these aren't the only open questions. There are many more. Any one of these can become a topic for a great research paper, maybe even an award-winning paper. Yeah, I encourage you guys to check some of these out on the Scientowiki website.
I was wondering about the future of open questions because the seminar format as the community opens up is going to be a little limited in terms of who can participate in the process of formulating open questions. And the thinking that goes into some of the formulations and in deriving these open questions is fairly complicated. Are we going to be opening up other parts of the workflow to admit new open questions? Specifically, I'm thinking that someone in another university might not have the opportunity to participate in the seminar, but they could submit a paper that has a fair reason to say, this is an open question I think that the community needs to consider. Is that something that we're looking at going forward?
Yeah, most definitely. So one of the ideas that I'll talk about a little bit later on in my presentation is the fact that these seminars have proven to be incredibly useful for formulating open questions for us. But practically speaking, not everyone can come and physically attend these seminars. So we want to encourage groups of emerging scientonomists outside of U of T and outside of the IHPSD to form their own communities and to submit their open questions to the encyclopedia. And if they sound reasonable enough and they're not repetitions or rewordings of questions we already have, then we're totally open to including those questions. On top of that, we've discussed briefly, at least in terms of the editorial team of the Journal of Scientonomy, we've discussed the idea that maybe we can accept papers that are just explicitly formulating a new open question and saying, hey, this is a question we haven't identified. Someone should probably answer this. And so you can allow people to submit papers that are just trying to suggest that there's an open question that we haven't considered that's very important and to explain why it's important in a super short paper. Then we can add it to our list of open questions. Make sense? Yeah. Cool, I will continue. So we spoke about open questions. Now we want to move towards understanding how we can store our observational scientonomic data. The current workflow lacks a very important part. I can't believe Greg and Jakob missed this, but anyway. We lack a proper database where the data from observational scientonomy can be properly stored. So we have our encyclopedia, and this is fantastic for fixing the current state of theoretical scientonomy and tracing all of our changes to it over time. What it doesn't really work for is the storing of data that we get from observational scientonomy. Let me explain why this is a problem. So we have a timeline on the bottom. Let's say we want to reconstruct a mosaic from a specific year. So we're just going to pick arbitrarily. We're going to pick 1720. We have a map of Europe, and say we want to zoom in on Britain. We want to reconstruct the mosaic of the British scientific community. A proper reconstruction of just this mosaic at just this time is probably going to include thousands of propositions. Make sense? Now you can multiply these thousands of propositions in this single mosaic by the more or less thousands of communities that will be found around the world at any given time period. The scope of scientonomy is to include all communities. And so if we have thousands of different historical communities, each with their own distinct mosaics, and they're all changing slowly over time, we're gonna end up with millions of propositions together with their respective acceptance records, right? Part of my point is that the encyclopedia as is not the proper tool for storing these millions of individual data points or millions of individual propositions. Instead, what we need is a proper database. The tree of knowledge database is what we're envisioning. Essentially, we've taken the idea of the tree of life database, which is an online resource that has gathered up information on all biological organisms and can trace their kind of evolutionary history. That's our inspiration, except instead of tracing changes in biological organisms over time, we're tracing changes in belief systems over time. Once this tree of knowledge database is created, then the workflow that we have is going to acquire a new tool for storing data. It's going to work in partnership with the encyclopedia. So the database is going to be the main repository for all of the data in observational Scientonomy, data on the mosaics of the past. And then the encyclopedia will continue to help us fix the current state and trace changes in theoretical Scientonomy. Now, the approach that we're taking makes us part of, or we can be considered part of the digital humanities. We've looked into many different digital humanities projects, and what we've noticed is that there are 3 key features that we think makes our database different. 1, there are a few that focus on belief systems. 2, few that focus on the belief systems of communities. And 3, importantly, and Jakob went into detail about this, few databases that focus on the belief systems of communities and understanding them in a semantically meaningful way. There's one that we've found that is fantastic at this. It's called the Database of Religious History. It's based out of UBC, so it's a fellow Canadian project. And essentially, the way that the Database of Religious History works, this is a screenshot from the website. The way that it works is it's going to list all the different regions of the world and all the different religions that are part of this, that are part of the world, I guess. So no moon-based religions. And give you timelines and information about these religions. Importantly, the aim of this database of religious history is to store data on different religions, so these are belief systems, right, in a semantically meaningful way. Let's say we take the Old Norse religion. We can click on it and we have a sort of image of a map where approximately we think where this religion was practiced. We can also scroll down on the page and it has a list of topics that can be filled in with specific information. So if you're thinking from a perspective of religious studies, certainly all religions have certain beliefs about supernatural entities, beliefs about the afterlife, beliefs about burial. They have certain set of norms and morals that they want to encourage among their religious followers. And so you can enter all of that data here and store it in a semantically meaningful way. We want to ideally try to replicate this, but rather than for religious communities, we want to do it for epistemic communities. Any questions about our Tree of Knowledge project?
Just in terms of the fact that it's difficult to identify a community, like even if you're taking the community of England in the 1720s as kind of this monolithic entity, given that, like you said, from year to year there might be so many changes, and so the community from one year to the next might be different even in small ways.
Yeah.
So just in terms of how you would represent it on the website, I'm curious as to how that would work. Or even for this one, in terms of like a religion, I mean, beliefs are going to change over time. So I'm just wondering how it's represented there.
So I think there are sort of 2 questions buried here. One is how to trace how these beliefs are changing over time. One simple solution is to have a bar that you can scroll along where you can start at the year of the inception of whatever community we're talking about. It might not go like year by year because it's hard to get to the precise details. But maybe every decade or so, you can kind of shift ahead and see what has changed every decade, if they've accepted new theories, if they've rejected others. And then if there's, for whatever reason, I don't know, there's a sort of mosaic split or something like that going on where we think the community has perhaps ended or split in 2, then that's where the timeline bar will end, if that makes sense. So that's one way that we have sort of imagined that we can trace these changes over time. I think the second question you had was about it's hard to identify communities. How do we do this? Part of this Tree of Knowledge project, we need to pick a very clear community that we can use as a kind of trial in order to say, okay, let's trace this small specific community that everyone agrees is a community. So my point is we'll start by picking clear-cut examples and then kind of grow from there. And in that way, we'll be able to obviously say that, hey, the boundaries of this community are vague, or presently, in certain senses, you can say, oh, there's an international scientific community. It's everywhere. Are we just going to glow the whole planet for that? That'll be kind of weird. Another way to do it might be to identify specific research centers to say, CERN is located right here. This is where that community answers this set of questions. They have this set of beliefs. They delegate to these other communities, and communities delegate to them. That kind of thing. There are practical paths forward. I mean, awesome questions to be bringing up. Cool. So the final part of my talk, what I want to talk about is our outreach, what we've done and how we want to outreach in the future to our colleagues in both HBS and our colleagues in the scientific community as well. Until now, Our main goal has been to sort of do a proof of concept. We want to prove that our workflow actually works. So we've used it in our small Scientonomic community, and we've detected its flaws and fixed those flaws as best as we can, and we think that it is something that actually works. So now that we've established it and reasonably tested it in our small, close-knit community, it's time to start our outreach campaign where we're going to reach out to scholars in HBS, to those historians and philosophers and sociologists of science, and also to scientists themselves. And we want to see who might be interested in collaborating with us. How are we going to do this outreach project? First things first, we will have to escalate our presentations. So we've already started spreading the word via certain presentations, both at conferences. Greg was at a fantastic conference on integrated HPS back early January, and the response to Scientonomy was phenomenal. Talked to him about it afterwards. Through colloquia presentations, we have planned a panel at Sea Ships so we can reach out to fellow Canadian HPSers. We're also planning to sort of continue making regular YouTube videos so that we can have small snippets of information where you can kind of be like, what does this observational Scientonomy mean? I don't understand. You can click a link and get a quick blurb so that you fully understand what this is. Part two, we need to expand our set of publications. The publications in our journal, the Journal of Scientonomy that is, they aim at advancing our scientonomic knowledge, but it's also important to publish in more general journals. This is going to help us reach a much wider audience. So obviously these papers in these more general journals aren't going to be proposing modifications to our scientonomic knowledge or modifications to our understanding of specific mosaics at specific times. What it will do is it will kind of discuss and celebrate the fruits of our labor, what we have done and accomplished, and how our system works, and spread the word about what we're doing here and how it might apply to these different communities. Finally, our community is incredibly collaborative. We encourage collaboration and working together as much as we can, and we want to encourage collaboration moving into the future as well. We're encouraging all interested scholars to come and join us in our effort in many different ways. In one way, we need peer reviewers, like any journal needs peer reviewers. So we need peer reviewers to bring their expertise to assess the modifications that fellow Scientonomists, especially the observational Scientonomists, are making. We also want those outsider community to publish with us in the Journal of Scientonomy, to bring their new perspectives, to bring their new ideas, and to help us shape theoretical Scientonomy and observational Scientonomy in ways that we haven't yet thought of. This I spoke to a little bit earlier, but we want to also encourage as many people to join our seminar sessions. These are kind of the face-to-face interactions that we have with the Scientonomic community. It doesn't always work that everyone can kind of be present there, but we are also a virtual community, and so the idea of someone being interested in a specific topic and wanting to participate via webcam or something like that is totally on the table and a completely reasonable step forward for spreading the word of Scientonomy. Finally, we have our modifications online. This is the easiest way to participate. It's to jump on, read through the proposed modifications, assess them, make comments, agree, disagree, give reasons for that, so that we can assess those comments and try to reach a consensus on the current position on a given proposed modification. Okay, last thing. How can you all contribute here? We have sort of 4 steps for how you can contribute. They're going to be completely unknown steps that we haven't reiterated repeatedly in this presentation. Step number 1, learn your Scientonomy, start commenting on the suggested modifications, and help us fill out our encyclopedia to make it as full as possible. And as Greg mentioned, these encyclopedias will never be complete or full, but help us by filling that out. Step 2, participate in the seminar and help identify the important open questions. Alternatively, you can always organize your own seminar and send your questions into the encyclopedia, and we're happy to post them, because naturally, if someone outside of our seminar group thinks of their own set of questions and thinks that they're justified, and they have a solid understanding of Scientonomy, those are great reasons to include the open questions on the encyclopedia. Step 3, choose one of those open questions Formulate your suggested modifications in response to those open questions and submit your research paper to the journal. This is how we communicate our ideas and how we have them formally proposed to the Scientonomic community in order to be actually assessed by the Scientonomic community. And last but not least, step 4, participate in our workshops. Some of these modifications will be contentious. They will not be so easily agreed upon. So to help us reach a consensus, we'll have to organize a workshop where we can meet face-to-face and where we can discuss these specific modifications and defend them, argue for them, argue against them, in order to reach a point where we can reach a consensus, I guess. I think that's all that I have. Yeah, thank you so much.